The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back. Lovin' baseball when we were 12 and innocent. My guest is retired ESPN journalist David Kindred. Do you go by Dave or David?
Dave, yes. David yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'll call you Dave. I was trying to be a little more formal given that your stature, and but if you allow me, I will call you Dave, or if you prefer Mr. Kindred, you certainly deserve that too.
No, Dave is all the honorific I need.
All right, Dave. Thank you. I want to go back with you to when you were 12 and innocent and a baseball fan. What year was that?
I was 12 years old in 1953.
1953, when the Yankees played the Dodgers. The Yankees were in the midst of that dynasty of winning 5 years in a row, and the Dodgers were in the World Series, arguably the greatest Dodger team. They won it all in 55, but in 53, Jackie Robinson was more in his prime, and I think they were the greatest team. And if I look back in my memory, it could have been the two best teams that ever played in a World Series. So that was the year you were enjoying baseball as a 12-year-old who was innocent, I presume. Tell me about
yeah.
Tell me about your fandom.
Well, I loved baseball. I played Little League baseball in a little town in central Illinois, Lincoln, Illinois. Every summer I went to my grandmother's house. I actually lived in a little town called Atlanta, Illinois, 10 miles from Lincoln. Atlanta was so small we didn't have Little League baseball. So every summer I stayed with my grandmother in Lincoln so that I could play baseball. In that part of Illinois, you're either a Cubs fan or a Cardinals fan. I was a Cardinals fan, and I think most of that was caused by the fact that every night I could listen to KMOX and hear Harry Carey, the original Harry Carey, the real Harry Carey, the Harry Carey who was not yet a cartoon, the Harry Carey who was a great baseball announcer. So I grew up listening to Harry Carey every night. And that fixed me as a Cardinals fan forever.
Who was your favorite player? Who did you worship?
Then of course Musial was great. Stan Musial was great. I wanted to be a sports writer. The first time that my mother bought me a typewriter, I sat at the typewriter and thought, this is literally true, Ralph, I'm going to remember the first words I ever typed. So I sat there for like 5 minutes, and then I typed Stanley Frank Musial, because he was the greatest player on that team. I was a little guy. I associated more with, infielders, Sally Hemus type, Red Shandings, so it was. I grew up wanting to be a Major League Baseball player until I actually saw a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. And then I realized I was not going to be a Major League Baseball player.
Reporting about it is a little easier than facing one.
Yes. So it was baseball was always my thing. And back then, of course, the first game that I remember watching on television, and I'm sure I saw other games before this, but not many. It was like one game a week, maybe Saturday. I think there was one game on Saturday every week on television. And then the World Series
Dizzy
was
Dean,
all of
as a
it.
matter of fact.
Dizzy Dean. And the first game I literally remember is October 6th, 1956. Don Larson's perfect game. I skipped school that day and sat at home and watched it and kept score, actually. And I've spent much of my life wondering what I ever did with that scorebook. I wish I had kept it. But so then I was 15 years old, and I knew what baseball was about. And so it was baseball has been, I became a columnist, sports columnist, so I've written about everything, for the Washington Post, the Louisville Courier-Journal, Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I've been a sports columnist writing about everything, but baseball was always the game that I most liked to write about because I understood baseball better than anything else.
To get off the subject of when you were 12 for a second, I just want to say that what appeals to me about your career is that you transcended your journalistic skills into the media, as it were. How did that come to be? How did I think you were the first true journalist at ESPN?
Well, I was never really an ESPN guy, Ralph. But I've done a whole lot of stuff for ESPN. But I always had a newspaper job, and whatever I did on television was always just kind of a side thing. I wasn't really I was never paid, for instance, by ESPN. But I did a lot of work for them on things like their Sports Century series, where they would interview journalists about great sports events or great sports figures. So the TV, I was never a TV guy. That came, real late in my career.
Okay, that answers my question. Getting back to when you were 12 and innocent, what comes to mind as the first thing that you knew it was a business, not a sport?
I don't know if I ever knew that, until I became a professional sports writer. To me, baseball was a game. It wasn't a business. I never thought of it as a business. I just wanted to play. I loved the feel of the dirt. I loved the whole feel of the game. And so I think I was 17 years old when my father challenged me to a race to first base. He beat me to first base. He was 47 years old at the time. I was 17. So one more evidence that I wasn't going to be a Major League Baseball player. But it was not until I was, maybe 30 and started to understand the holdouts, started to understand free agency, that then it really became, that wasn't what I liked about the game. I just liked the competition. I liked what happened between the white lines. I didn't care about the business of it. But I am old enough, of course, to remember when Stan Musial was the first $100,000 player, even before Pete Rose. Pete Rose always said he wanted to be the first $100,000 player, but Musial made that money before Rose did. But all of that is not why I, as a 12-year-old, or let's say 15, when I knew I wanted to be a sports writer, cared about it. I just cared about the game, the competition, how they did it, the craft of the game. That's what I cared about.
Okay, what were you surprised about when you became a sports writer? To rephrase my original question, when you got into the business, What surprised you?
I was surprised by how big the stadiums were. You know, these are giant buildings. Surprised by that, but surprised much more by how big the players were. You know, these were not your average, ordinary men. These were, you know, they were all big guys. Even the little guys, what we thought of as little guys, were big guys, because only the best animals in the forest are professional athletes. You know, they're quicker, they're stronger, they're faster. You know, their eyes are better. All of that. That's why they're able to do athletic things that are denied to us mortals. I mean, they really are, you know, the greatest, the best of the species, athletically. You know, and so it was always amazing to me what they could do.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the things that they did intellectually that helped them become better players? I mean, you mentioned the fact that they're all skilled athletically, but how much do brains come in to success in?
Well, you know, I think that certainly you have to be committed to the game. You have to be committed to understanding why things work and why things don't work. But still, if you don't have the athletic ability, it doesn't make any difference how smart you are or how much you know. You're never going to be a great major league, or you know, you're never going to be a major league baseball player to begin with. You know, I mean, there have been great managers. Sparky Anderson was, you know, 220 hitter. You know, the Cardinals manager today, Mike Still, never played at all. Walter Alston played one game. So it's, I think certainly the very best of them are intellectually good too. But if you had to choose, do you want the smartest guy that you see on the field, or do you want the biggest, strongest, fastest guy? You know, I think give me the biggest, strongest, fastest guy, and I'll let the smart guy teach him something.
Okay, that certainly makes sense. Was there a player that you met in your journalistic career that you were absolutely awed by?
Well, the one that comes to mind first, and again, because he's a little guy, you know, relatively speaking, was Joe Morgan with the Cincinnati Reds. I was working in Louisville at the time, 80 miles from Cincinnati, when the Big Red Machine got big. So I was in Cincinnati a lot, and Joe Morgan was the best. Joe Morgan was kind of the melding of what we were just talking about, Ralph, the great athlete and the great mind. Morgan was maybe 5'7", weighed maybe 175, 180, but he was built like a rock. He was very strong, very quick, great hands, and he had a lot of home runs in the sense that, you know, he wasn't a singles hitter, but
he
the
had what they
intellectual
call punch.
Yes, you know, and he carried around a little black book. One time, I remember this was in the clubhouse at Wrigley Field. I saw him, and I was always hanging around him because he always had great observations about the game and about people. And I asked him what that little book was. He said, "It's my book." I said, "Well, I know it's your book, but what are you writing down in it?" He said, "You think I'm going to tell you?" You know, because he would keep notes on pitchers. You know, he'd keep notes on things that happened in the game. You know, because he was a student of the game. You know, later he became a broadcaster, of course, and I think he irritated a lot of listeners because he seemed to know everything. He seemed to have an opinion on every move in a game. And it didn't irritate me. It delighted me, because that's the way that I like to think about the game. And but he was that rare combination of brains and great athletic ability.
Okay. What came to mind when you were talking about that was Jim Brosnan, who sat in the bullpen and wrote 2 terrific books.
Yes, he did.
The Pennant Race and I can't think of the other name. I don't either. But he humanized baseball players to me, and he had kept notes in the book, and that's what brought him to mind. How did Joe Morgan humanize himself to you? In other words, I asked the question, who are you awed by? Once you got to know him, I'm guessing the awe went away, that he was a human being.
Well, I wasn't around him enough, outside the ballpark to know that. I just knew that he was fully committed to the game, every pitch, every at-bat. He studied the game and he understood it. He could have been a great manager, I think. I mean, in the sense of tactics and strategy, I'm not sure he could have taught anybody because, he was unique, and, a lot of great players are not teachers because they don't know how they've done it. They can't explain, how to do it better. They just know how they do it. And like in basketball, I one time asked Julius Erving, Dr. J, about a play he made in the game. He didn't even remember making the play. To me, it was like the most astounding thing I'd ever seen. It goes under the basket on one side and comes out on the other side, and then does a dunk like behind his head. How do you do that? He didn't even remember doing it. So some people can teach it and some people can't. But Morgan, I liked him because I like to think that's the kind of player I would have been if I had had any physical athletic skill that, was 1/10 of what Joe Morgan was. Because he was looking for every edge that he could get. He wanted to know what, this pitcher threw to him in this situation, and he could tell you. And it was no accident, by the way, that every time Jerry Koosman pitched for the Mets, Joe Morgan didn't feel good that day and took a day off because he didn't want to bat. He didn't want to hit against that guy. Right.
He knew who he owned, and he knew who owned him.
Yes.
And that's very important. I'll bet he took no day offs against the guy he did well against.
No, but he didn't like. There were several left-handers that he didn't like, and he would be resting on that day. But not many, because he was a great. Morgan, he's a Hall of Famer, but Morgan was just, my favorite player. Once I got out of, being 12 years old and innocent, once I passed that and began to understand really how good these people were and what it took to be good, Morgan became my favorite player because he was such a combination of everything. He was what they call a 5-tool player, and he played second base. I used to talk to him about the gloves that he had. I wanted to write a book one time about gloves. So I was always talking to players, especially infielders, about their gloves. And Morgan wore one that was barely bigger than his hand. And that's because he wanted to get the ball in his glove and out of his glove on a double play as fast as he could.
It reminds me of Bill Mazeroski. They called him No Hands.
Yes.
Because he did just that, in and out. Who were the journalists? You mentioned by the time you were 16 that you knew you wanted to be a sports writer. Who were the journalists that you grew up reading and influenced you?
Red Smith. Red Smith was, in my mind, the best sports columnist ever. And I used to, as a kid, And these summers when I stayed at my grandmother's house in Lincoln, Illinois, every Sunday I would go to the train station in Lincoln and pick up the Chicago newspapers. There were 4 or 5 of them at that time. And Red Smith's column, while syndicated out of New York, would appear in the Chicago papers.
It was in the Herald Tribune in New York, and he was wonderful. I read him every morning. I didn't, to this day, know that his column was syndicated all over the country. I had no idea.
Yes. That's how I came to read it. And I thought that, he was always having fun. His columns had humor. His columns had music in them. His columns had a different feel than other sports stories. And he went to nice places, and I thought, I'd really like to do that. And so I was a reader and writer as a kid, and I copied Red a lot. I copied Sports Illustrated people a lot at the time. If while you're learning to write, nothing wrong with copying people, until you get your own voice, your own viewpoint comes through. And Red was the best, and that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be Red Smith. I wanted to be a sports columnist. I wanted to go to the World Series. I wanted to go to NFL championship games. I wanted to go, wherever sports columnists can go. What I wanted to do. And I'm sure that I'm absolutely lucky in that I knew at 15 what I wanted to do, and happily spent the next 50 years doing it.
You're blessed, absolutely. Dave, what a terrific first interview. Will you come back and continue this?
Of course I would. I would love to talk about that. I've done a book now.
I can tell you that there were so many things that you mentioned that directly correlated to my life. Sally Hemus, first baseball card I ever saw was Sally Hemus. There was a television.
How many of us, Ralph, would even know who Sally Hemus is? But so that's great.
The first third base coach that the New York Mets ever had was Sally Hemus.
Yeah.
And just bringing back Dr. J, it's a visual thing in one's mind. I picture him gliding through the air, starting at almost the top of the key to dunk, let alone the fancy ones. I grew up in New York. There was Connie Hawkins. Connie Hawkins was Dr. J before Dr. J.
I saw Hawkins play in the ABA. Amazing player.
Yes,
Pittsburgh
absolutely.
Condors.
Yes, we have a lot to talk about in the future, Dave Kindred. Welcome to Comfortably Zoned, and you made me feel good, and that's part of the game.
Well, good, Ralph. Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. It's the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Lovin' baseball when we were 12. I had a great one today with Dave Kindred. Happy trails, everyone.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.